very excited for this chat here today on the past, present, and future of MEV. We have Edgar from Jito, Ben from Temporal, and Nitesh from DFlow. Guys, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, sure. I'll go first. My name's Edgar. I work at Jito. I was one of the first engineers on the engineering team. I currently work on some of Jito's high-performance features, building out the block engine, also new features that make the block engine faster, and stuff like that.
Yo, I'm Ben, co-founder and CEO of Temporal. We're a crypto-native R&D firm. We've done all sorts of work in MEV, high-performance computing, validator optimization, stuff like that.
Hey guys, my name is Nitesh. I'm the CEO of DFlow. We build a low latency, high precision DEX aggregator on Solana and expose it via swap API to wallets and work with market makers on quoting.
Great. So first I wanted to set the context for the conversation. MEV as a term has been thrown around a lot and has become like watered down. Like, could you guys give me like a definition of MEV and like what is the distinction between what you would describe as benign MEV and malicious MEV?
Yeah, I'll kick off. So I view MEV as sort of like a natural consequence of the fact that state on a blockchain is contested at the same time by different participants, and MEV is how those different participants like express their sort of like desire for that state. I think malicious MEV is MEV that ends up having like a negative effect on like users of the network, and other forms of MEV are more benign.
Yeah, so I can kind of continue there. Yeah, I mean, like MEV, I just kind of view as every market has inefficiencies, right? And in like DeFi market, those efficiencies just so happen to, end up captured by validators and block builders more often than not, right? Because the validators and the block builders are in that ultimate position to, capture your arbitrage to, quote wherever they want on an order book. Validators are kind of, just like in this ultimate position to capture any kind of market inefficiency because they're the ones that are ordering the blocks.
Yeah, so MEV itself has had several definitions. Over the past couple of years, I think the first version of MEV, the M actually stood for miner, which is kind of interesting. So back in proof of work where miners were still a thing. And to answer the question of like how do you draw the line between good and malicious MEV, I think that line has always been somewhat hotly contested. Even before Jito at Flashbots on Ethereum land, there was a very famous quote from Phil saying, validators, don't be ashamed to extract. Anything that results in more revenue to you goes to more security for the network. And I think that's like a somewhat reasonable argument to make. But I think as the blockchain has gotten more sophisticated, I think later companies, like particularly us at Jito, have started to take this approach where we define good MEV as MEV that doesn't have negative externalities for users and user welfare. So that's where we personally draw the line.
Awesome. And I wanted to ask, how have you guys seen MEV evolve on Solana over the past like 2 years, like from the end of 2023 up until today?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak a little bit. Like I think there's definitely a lot that's similar, right? Like I think like the block ordering logic across clients is, roughly similar to what it was then. I think the clients are, faster, a little bit more efficient now. Like I think the Jito auctions are also like a little bit faster now. It's definitely like, there's a lot more money in it now. It's a lot more competitive. There's, a lot more volume than there was, the beginning of 23. So I think it's definitely, it's ramped up a lot. Like capture's definitely, I'd say, more efficient than it was then. And there's like a lot more volume, which is, like indicative that, like people are using Solana now in like 2025 a lot more than they were in 2023.
Are there any standardized metrics for MEV on Solana specifically? A lot of people equate geotips with MEV. Edgar, do you think that's a fair assumption?
I think it's a reasonable first order proxy given how correlated Jito tips are to priority fees and how correlated those two things like fluctuate with the general volumes of the chain in general. I think generally what we optimize for is tip revenues in addition to what we've mentioned before, which is user welfare.
Yeah, that's a fair answer. One topic that I want to discuss in relation to MEV that I think is under discussed and not many people know about is transaction lending services. Ben, I know you work at Temporal and Temporal works Nosami. Can you walk us through what Nosami is basically? Like why is it needed and maybe how will you compare it to something like Block's route?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question, right? Like obviously, I think as we all know, from trying to do this over the years, landing transactions on Solana is really hard. Everyone wants to get in fast. They want to be like top of block. They want to have just the lowest, average latency possible for sending those transactions, right? Like, and it's really complicated, right? Like, sometimes it's optimal to send to Jito. Sometimes it's optimal to send to like the validator's TPU. Sometimes it's optimal to do something completely different or, to do some combination of those things, right? So like it's really, really complicated. There's like a million ways you can send. Different validators are running different schedulers, right? Nozomi kind of just like abstracts all this away, right? It's like the users won't have to worry about any of this really overcomplicated stuff. And all they do is send us their transaction, right? And, we'll handle all the weird, hard market structural stuff and, the million validator clients, and we'll land their transaction as fast as possible. I guess you could say, like you mentioned Block's route, I guess they kind of try to do something similar, but, anyone who's ever like gone on chain and like tested them side by side, I'd say, one is clearly better than the other. Just speaking from the data that's on chain, and go try it yourself if you don't believe me.
Okay, nice. One related topic is SIMD 96. Which is a Solana proposal that discontinued the burn on the priority fee. And the goal was to basically discourage out of protocol arrangements for transaction inclusion. Do you guys think that SIMD 96 has been successful so far?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can kind of speak to this, right? SIMD 96, like I definitely say was a net positive, right? It just like removes a lot of the incentive to do side payments, and it increases your incentive to send priority fees to the chain. Priority fees really are just MEV at the end of the day, right? That said, I think there's still a lot of incentive for out-of-band payments, right? For example, there's still no way other than Jito for searchers to express their transaction ordering preferences. There's also still no way outside of Jito for users to express, revert protection preferences, right? And like without overcomplicating things too much, right? Like, there's many users that want to send transactions that are revert protected in the sense that if they land on chain, they succeed, they cannot fail, right? Obviously this might be more expensive to process, but like what you'll actually see is, if people are all competing for an opportunity and their transactions are revert protected, that opportunity will be captured, much more efficiently. Stuff like Jito is obviously going to be able to make validators a lot more money despite like SIMD 96.
Yeah, I think to oversimplify the argument for and against SIMD 96 is that the positive is that validators earn more money. The negative is that validators earn more money. Because the money comes from the pocket of inflation, and inflation is just an inherent tax on the network in terms of people who aren't staking their soul.
Nice. Moving on, like from transaction inclusion to like the market making side, there was a pretty popular article by Max Resnick and Tolley called "The Path to Decentralized Nasdaq." It seems like a core focus for Solana developers today is how do you make central limit order books viable, like on chain. Nitesh, could you speak to us like to the structural disadvantage that market makers have today on Solana, like compared to like toxic takers?
Yeah. So in high frequency trading and just in general, there's this concept and bifurcation of like the types of market participants. Some market participants post liquidity, others take liquidity. The liquidity posters are market makers, and liquidity takers are market takers. So on Solana, there's a structural disadvantage to being a market maker as opposed to the taker, and this effectively is because of sort of like the different nature of market making versus market taking. In market making, you always have liquidity live. Anyone can come and trade with you. That's the point of being a market maker. You capture the spread between where you post your bid and your ask. A market taker, their goal is effectively just to trade with sort of like actively resting liquidity in a way that will, at some point in the very near future, allow them to basically say, hey, that was a good trade. And a lot of sort of like market takers measure this in terms of marking to sort of like the midpoint between the bid and ask. The reason why that on Solana, this is takers have a structural advantage is takers can sort of like opportunistically choose when to trade, as opposed to makers who must kind of like always be available to trade, and they don't get to choose when they are traded with. So this is obviously a problem in sort of like a single leader Solana network structure, because the taker could just wait until they have sort of like, you know, a monopoly on how they land transactions, and then pick off every resting quote. And so this sort of structure makes it very difficult to be a market maker on Solana. But there are a lot of sort of like things that are happening that will, in my opinion, sort of like change this for the better in the coming months.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And one of the solutions that's proposed is just how do you figure out a way to prioritize cancels? I know you may have different opinions on this, so what are your thoughts on like prioritizing cancels for the market makers?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can go. Yeah, I mean, you know, this is something that's definitely already been tried in TradFi, right? You know, like it didn't work out very well in TradFi, right? You know, without going into the market structural details of it, when you prioritize cancels, you'll just get toxic cancels instead of toxic takes, and like your cancel to, you know, actual fill ratio is going to be very, very, very high. And I mean, like what you'll see is that, you know, like the fills that the users get still really doesn't actually end up being that good relative to, you know, the way most modern order books are designed, which is price time priority, right? That said, you know, I still think this constrains our thinking a little bit too much, right? You know, everyone's trying to make CLOBs, you know, central limit order books work in DeFi and on Solana, but you know, like central limit order books never have the best quotes on Solana, right? And you know, we should all be asking ourselves why this is, right? And you know, why other, you know, AMMs / like market makers not running on CLOBs are able to give you better quotes, right? I think that it's probably time that, you know, DeFi gets something that was more designed for DeFi, and like I think the central limit order book is, you know, just it was built for a centralized environment where everyone's co-located, and you know, I think it's time for us to come around to the idea that, you know, maybe it wasn't meant to be.
I think a spicy take that I have personally, in my view, is that I don't think there's anything fundamentally about the chain Solana the way it's currently designed that would prevent a really competent team from building a hyperliquid killer. I think when talking about things like maker priority, cancellation priority, there's a lot of like the design space for solving these problems is extremely large, and the sort of invasiveness of some of these proposed changes also varies in sort of scope, from, you know, all the way up to, you know, multi-concurrent proposers, application-specific sequencing. One pretty interesting, I think, innovation that's happened in the last couple of months in the sort of landing space design for these DEXs, particularly around these new variants of like dark pool AMMs, is takes advantage of the fact that Solana currently, the scheduler, sorts non-Jito transactions by fee density, which is priority fees divided by compute units requested. And so you can kind of design an AMM that has built-in maker priority as a consequence of this. And the way that you do that is that you make cancels and maker orders super, super small in terms of CU, and then you make takes really, really expensive. And so naturally, the scheduler will prioritize sort of more or less deterministically the smaller transactions, which gets you the cancellation priority for free.
Yeah, I think like application controlled execution is generally a good thing, primarily because it sort of rebalances some of the market structure towards market makers, whereas right now it's like heavily skewed towards in favor of takers. So it's good from that perspective, but I think it's always worth remembering like the goal should be to have balanced market structure for both takers and makers, and not sort of like disproportionately favor one versus the other. And then I'm maybe a little bit more optimistic on Klobs coming to Solana than Ben is, but I think like it may not appear in sort of like the ways that we expect it to. I think, for example, with a lot of like what Edgar called dark pool AMMs, I think better term for that is prop AMMs, by the way, because like the quotes are technically lit, and next thing you know, like regulators are going to be like, what are these dark pool AMMs? So prop AMMs is probably a better term for that, and more accurate as well. But like a lot of them are individual high frequency makers that will like quote directly on chain, and then the aggregator acts as like an order book de facto, and can match takers versus makers from that sense. So yeah, I'm optimistic, but it may not look like what we expect it to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Since you run it like an aggregator, which is DFlow, I'm wondering like, you have a concept called conditional liquidity. How can it help like reduce toxic order flow specifically?
Conditional liquidity is this idea that if you can somehow get information about the originator of the flow on chain in a way that is like viewable and like reasonable by the actual DEX that is providing liquidity, then that DEX will be able to sort of like adjust the spread that they quote more specifically to the toxicity of the flow effectively. So the idea, which this is not a novel idea, it exists in traditional finance, it exists in various forms in DeFi as well. Like, you know, you can argue that Hyperliquid has a form of conditional liquidity as well. The idea is you basically just tag the wallet that originated it, and the wallet that originated the flow can sort of like endorse the flow as, hey, this was from my user, and then the DEX can tighten their quotes because, hey, look, it's a order from Phantom, like a Phantom UI, right? And so can offer it a better price.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And Ben, just to reiterate, you're not like very bullish on Klobs on chain, if I'm understanding correctly. Does that mean you think that prop AMMs like SolFi and ZeroFi can provide like better like spreads for like quoting on chain?
Yeah, I mean, like, like I think like for Klobs to work, there's definitely a lot of changes we need to make to the protocol. Just like particularly, we need much better censorship resistance and much shorter slot times, right? Like if we got slot times really, really, really short, right, and we added censorship resistance to the chain beyond just shortening slot times, like for example, if you had multiple concurrent proposers and like 10 to 20 millisecond slot times, really hard thing to do, but it's possible. Like I think we definitely see our spreads on Klobs get like quite a bit tighter right now. Would they get tighter than the SolFis and the ZeroFis of the world? I think that's much harder to say, right? Like I think the SolFis and ZeroFis of the world definitely have a lot of structural advantages that allow them to do a lot of things, really creative things that, to be honest, are not possible on a Klob. And like I think when you're running in a DeFi or just like a decentralized execution environment, I think it's really advantageous to have most of your market making logic on chain. And that's just not possible in a Klob. And it's not really a problem in a centralized exchange Klob because everyone's co-located, right? So like there's no penalty to running your logic on your own box and then submitting your order to the book because you're co-located with the book. But like in DeFi, this is never going to be the case, right? And like, given that that's not the case, and you're at such a huge disadvantage compared to like the SolFis of the world, like I think quoting as tight as a SolFi on a Klob is going to be really hard, if not completely infeasible.
I think one of the really interesting design decisions that SolFi and ZeroFi have made that have enabled them to make tighter quotes is they kind of were designed around aggregators as a first-class citizen. Basically, the fact that SolFi and ZeroFi really only work when you route to when you hit it via Jupyter, which is Solana's aggregator, kind of means that they know with a very high degree of certainty that all the order flow that they're getting, or most of it, is going to be non-toxic, given that it's just very, very difficult to sort of hit Jupyter API if you're like somebody who really wants to be toxic and sharp, due to the latency constraints involved in getting a response from the Jupyter API.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And moving out to like core protocol proposals, like a goal for ANSI is just to double block size and eventually like reduce slot times. And there's also been a lot of big chatter about first come, first serve. Do you guys have any takes on that, on the possible timelines and the outlook?
Just like timelines for like overall protocol changes. Yeah, I mean, so look, Alpenglow, like I think we'd consider probably like the next big change for Solana that like sets a lot of this up, and like the other thing being massively reducing slot times, right? You know, I'm hoping we can have Alpenglow like at least on testnet by Q1 26, right? Maybe faster. We'll see, right? You know, there's some really good engineers working on these problems, but I definitely don't want to promise any specific timelines, but like I think I'd be pretty happy to see Alpenglow at least on testnet by like Q1 26, and then hopefully like mainnet roll out quickly after that. Sometime on that same time horizon, I would love to see a massive reduction in slot times. I think we can actually do that very, very soon, and like I think it's time to start prioritize doing that very, very soon. There's been a lot of discussion about that lately. I think that would be very, very beneficial to market structure on Solana, and I'm sure there will be a few other things that you can probably expect, maybe not directly correlated, but things like there's been rumors Jito's building something new, right? Things like that might really mix up market structure on Solana as well.
Yeah, and do you have any takes on first come first served and how it can solve MEV?
Yeah, I mean first come first serves like pretty good, right? Like if you have like a centralized like single sequencer, right? Maybe you're running like price time priority on the order book. Even if it's like decentralized, like first come first serve is like pretty good, market structurally, right? Because you can kind of enforce like price time priority on an order book. The problem is like how do you enforce first come first serve? We have 400 millisecond slots, 4 of them in a row. Later can order transactions however they want. They're incentivized to be maximally extractive. So I think that first come first serve would be better market structurally than what we have on Solana now. It's also just impossible to enforce without a good amount of protocol changes.
Do you think you can overcome that censorship with multiple concurrent leaders?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one step, right? Like, I don't think MCP is a magic bullet, but I do think that having better censorship resistance, which is what we get from multiple concurrent proposers, is a really good property to have. Now, you need more than just censorship resistance, right? Like, you also need, like globally agreed upon ticks, right? So like in the case of Solana, that is a slot, right? And then we need said ticks or slots to be as small as possible, right? Which allows applications to define their own ordering logic at a higher level of granularity, which, yeah, like right now on Solana, we don't have that. And, what you'll end up with is, if even one leader is trying to make your life miserable as a market maker, you need to assume that, that leader is going to wait 1.6 seconds, censor all your orders, and then pick you off at the very end of the slot, which means you're going to be quoting very, very wide, much wider than the Binances and Hyperliquids of the world.
Right. Edgar, I'm curious if application-specific sequencing gets implemented, what does that mean for like JITA auctions and JITA tips? Do you see any implications there?
Yeah, application-specific sequencing has been talked a lot. I think it's a pretty interesting idea, and independently of feasibility with the JITA auction, which kind of is just a separate scheduler at this point, you do run into a lot of really quirky kind of edge cases with application-specific sequencing, particularly involving weird conflicting dependencies. If different applications have different interpretations of how they want to prioritize things, like which one do you prefer if you run into like a collision? I think there's like a little bit of details that need ironing out before we sort of consider application-specific sequencing at a protocol level more generally.
Nitesh, do you have any takes on app-specific sequencing?
Yeah, I think like previously I mentioned how I like Ace, or like people come up with different names for these things, but like Ace and As are kind of the same thing. I like it. I don't think it solves like the problem of building optimal decentralized market structure, but it is like a big improvement over status quo from the perspective that it helps makers. There are other ways that makers can protect their quotes, and you see that happening a lot today. I think it was Edgar who mentioned sort of like, being intelligent about your CU usage for your cancels versus swaps and things like that. So I think it's an improvement. We'll just kind of have to wait and see how much it actually improves stuff.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And in terms, I've always had this question of one of the goals of ANS, as I mentioned previously, is just doubling block times and also like eventually halving the slot times. I'm curious on how halving the slot times is related like to MEV and how can that solve some of the toxic order flow?
Yeah, so I mean, like, like the longer slots are, the larger of a time window the leader has a monopoly over the entire market, right? Solana trades off, right? Every 1.6 seconds, right, you have a new leader. During that 1.6 seconds, I, as the leader, can do anything I want, right? And if I'm a maximally extractive leader, I'm gonna, stall everyone else's order book updates. I'm gonna stall all their Oracle updates. The very end of my slot, I'm just gonna sweep all of them out of the market, right? And what's gonna happen is they're all gonna lose a lot of money, and they're gonna start quoting really wide. And then spreads are going to be really wide, right? So like if I had to make this really, really simple, like longer slot times mean larger spreads, right? And larger spreads mean worse fills for users.
Yeah, I think there's kind of this running meme that one of the easiest ways to fix a problem that a mechanism designer has is to make time longer or to lengthen a block time or whatever. And I think that kind of ethos just generally goes counter to what Solana stands for, which is increasing bandwidth and decreasing latency. And so one of the examples of this is that the Jito block engine actually kind of froze time for 200 milliseconds prior to this year. And there's a lot of reasons why you would want like a longer look-back window, especially when it comes to running an auction or maximizing revenue for the chain. But these things that I said run counter to making quotes better, making the chain faster. So I think this April we actually shortened our auction interval and basically hence the the amount that we freeze time to 50 milliseconds, which has arguably hurt our revenue in the very short term because searchers have less of a time to bid as an optimal amount in terms of like the locks that are being held. But I think overall these are things that are good for the network overall.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm curious on Fire Dancer. Like today, like Ansat still has the most dominant validator with Agave. Like, do you think when Fire Dancer hits mainnet, like, do you expect them to take a minimum share of validators?
I mean, I guess I can go again. Yeah, I mean, I think there's like definitely a lot of things that Fire Dancer does very, very well, right? Like I think their tiled thread per core model is very good. I think they have some components that right now are more performant than Agave's components. But they also still have a long way to go, right? They're still far from being like a fully working, like full Fire Dancer client on mainnet, right? Their team's like very smart, right? Like their team's obviously very talented. But like, to have full Fire Dancer on mainnet, it's definitely going to be, a little bit longer, right? Maybe like 6 months, maybe like a year, maybe longer. It's hard to say. You would have to ask that team. But I do think one thing interesting we've been starting to see is they've been working on and improving their scheduler and their block packing algorithm. And like I definitely think that we're starting to see some of the benefits of those improvements. And I do think we're slowly seeing Frank and Dancer validators rise up in rewards earned, right? I also think there's some things they've done really well, right? Like their quick server is very fast, their shred verify is very fast, but for it to stand on its own as a full client, that's definitely going to take more time. But I think that as soon as people start earning more revenue on Frankendancer, and I think we're starting to get pretty close to that point, then people will start to switch. and then you'll really have the two clients competing to earn the most revenue possible. And I think we're probably a lot closer to that future than we think.
Yeah, I think one of the top of mind things in terms of importance when you ask a validator what their priorities are is how much money am I going to make? Like how much less or how much more am I going to make if I run a given client? And so as a result, validators tend to be very, very fee sensitive because just the margins, if you're a relatively low stake validator, are so low. And so I think a big concern with, like a big potential concern with some of these potential validators towards adopting Firedancer is a question of whether or not it'll be fully compatible with Jito, particularly because Jito tips are a pretty significant part of a validator's revenue nowadays. And I mean, you can look at the code; it's public. We're aiming to have full Firedancer compatibility on launch, which is going to be a good thing. And I'm just generally excited about how these core improvements at every part of Firedancer stack will kind of percolate to the rest of the network. Like, and I think they've already talked a little bit about the performance improvements that Firedancer has made, but just to give you like an idea of the amount of, or an idea of the context of the scale of their improvements, I think I heard somewhere that Firedancer like is able to keep up with the network on a single tile effectively, which is basically like 1/64th of their full computing capacity, which is pretty impressive given how fast Solana is already running. So I'm generally really excited about it.
Nitesh, does Firedancer have any implications at the application layer for things like DFlow?
Yeah, at the application layer, like the main consideration of these new types of clients is how much faster do they actually make the network. A lot of applications don't really need to think or reason about like the underlying sort of network structure and how transactions actually propagate, but they do benefit from the fact that latencies decrease. So for like sort of the application layer and its considerations of MEV, the only thing that we care about at that layer is the network getting faster, and we sort of get the positive externalities for free.
For the past months, we've seen the rise of meta aggregators like Titan, Camino Swap. Do you have any takes on how can that help like increase competitive in the swapping landscape?
Meta aggregators are like not super interesting. It's like it's just composing two different aggregators. Like technically, Phantom's been doing this for years, so it's not really interesting. It's sort of just like I don't know. It'll take like a couple hours to write a wrapper around multiple APIs to meta aggregate. So there's nothing really interesting happening there. I don't think it has any like long-term effects on anything.
Right. So I think like just to wrap it up, like what are you guys most excited about in the coming months for Solana that can help like reduce MEV?
That will reduce MEV, you said? That's a good question, right? I think there's definitely a lot of information asymmetry, as to what's going to happen at the protocol layer and what Jito's going to do and like things like that, right? So like I'm not really going to speculate as much on that. I'll speak more to like the application layer, right? And I think on that sense, I'd like kind of ask myself, how do you incentivize market makers to quote as fast as possible? I would, and as tight as possible, right? I would continue to be excited about seeing people move further away from clubs and, do a lot more research on, how do we actually build something, for DeFi, by DeFi traders, for DeFi traders that, is very efficient on DeFi and, can beat the spreads of, a club, not only on DeFi, but, possibly also in CeFi, right? I think this is actually very, very possible. And, I'm quite excited to see what kind of innovation is in front of us for, just overall DeFi market applications, DEX applications.
Yeah, I think in general, there's just a lot to be excited about Solana in the coming months, and particularly this year. I think some of the examples are, at the application level, Ellipsis made a sandwich-resistant DEX that they finally launched as a product called Gavel. So we'll see more and more projects take an application-level approach to mitigating, particularly sandwiching as an example of negative MEV. on our side at Jita, we've been working on some improvements to our block engine that we'll be announcing in the next couple of weeks. So personally, very excited about that, although I am obviously biased. And also excited to see more general Fire Dancer or Frankendancer adoption. As we mentioned, faster block times generally means that, epochs are shorter, people make more money, spreads get tighter, everybody's happy.
Yeah, I think by and far the most interesting thing happening on Solana right now is the sort of like rise of prop AMMs. It's a incredibly interesting phenomenon that is like basically arising over the many years of sort of like the natural evolution of Solana market structure, which is order flow exists and the market has figured out how to compete for it. And it looks like the primary sort of like form factor for competition are these prop AMMs that attempt to tighten the quote and play sort of like various games with discriminating against toxic order flow. So this is like incredibly good for users of the network. This is an incredibly positive sign that it's happening on like a truly decentralized network like Solana. And it's sort of like the future just forming before our eyes. And it's, super exciting and really good positive sign for Solana.
That's awesome. So it seems like both of you guys are very bullish on prop AMMs and Edgar as well, like taking over most of the order for highly liquid markets. Like for things like meme coins, which are still very prevalent on Solana, I think you'll still see AMMs like traditional, like Radiant dominate. What do you guys think?
Yeah, you'll still see sort of like the passive AMMs for tail tokens. The spreads are a lot wider and traders are a lot less price sensitive for those. So you'll like the product market fit on passive AMMs is definitely meme coins.
Awesome. I think this is a good place to end it. Do you guys have anything else that you want to add or we didn't touch on?
Call them prop AMMs. Don't call them dark pool AMMs, please.
I don't even think they're AMMs. Like, how about just like prop market makers or just prop market making contracts?
As long as we're not calling them dark pools, I'm happy.
So it's prop AMMs, no dark AMMs. Thank you guys. I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.